Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Daniella Bassi. Daniella is an editor at the Miles Institute. Hello, Daniella. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Lipton?
I'm great, Daniella. So Daniella, because you're one of the editors, you're basically my boss. Yes,
I guess in a certain sense.
yes, you're basically my boss. And what I like about the style at Miles is that the editors are quite clear. So as a writer, I can be rough, and you guys are quite adept at refining my writing to make it diplomatic and tactful. Yes, I notice that all the time. So, Daniela, today we'll be talking about pre-colonial societies and extraction. I'm interested in Latin American history, like yourself. And recently, you wrote two pieces, one on the Inca Empire and one on the Mayans. And I want to start by talking about the Inca Empire. So in 2001, and I must say this, I interviewed James Robinson and we debated these issues. And usually on this show, we do talk about colonialism and extraction. But in 2001, James Robinson, Simon Johnson, and Darren Asimuglu published a paper, and this paper today is a landmark paper arguing that colonialists created extractive institutions in some countries and inclusive institutions in other countries. And in the former countries, incomes are lower because of the extraction, because of the level of extraction. And Latin American countries were studied. But Daniela, in your recent piece for Mises, you have argued that pre-colonial Inca society was extractive. You refer to it as a Leviathan state. Tell us a little about that article.
Well, it definitely was a Leviathan state. It was based in Cuzco, and from there, the elites there expanded over other people and absorbed them, and they would put their officials there, kind of take, there were a lot of symbolic forms of conquest, like they would take the relics of conquered people and enshrine them in the Cusco temple, and they would put their own regional officials kind of over local leaders, and then those people, the conquered people, would become part of the Inca network and of the extractive system. So they would have to pay their labor especially, but also tribute in goods. And this was definitely required and couldn't be escaped. And there wasn't free travel. There were government agents posted in important cities, kind of checking who was coming and going. And people in different places wore different things, and they were required to wear these things so that they could be identified. That was certainly part of why they couldn't choose to wear something else. And I think just the way that something was, that it wasn't voluntary, that the people were absorbed and that they were forced to give their labor and the products of it, is extractive. So
Yes. Daniel, comment on the class structure. The panaqas and the Ayllus are how do you pronounce? When I was a student, we used to say Ayllus, but I'm seeing Ayllus. How do you pronounce this word?
well, I would say Ayllus. I will say that I'm not an Inca specialist. I have a master's degree in early American history, and my area is indigenous history, and it's mainly North American, but I broadly study indigenous history. So I'm not an expert in these particular people. I don't speak Quechua, but I did do a lot of digging and studying to write this piece and understand Incan civilization.
All right, then just tell us a little about these social groups.
Well, so the panca is kind of it's the lands that people own, and it includes the people that are on it. So the people are kind of, each community is kind of separated out into their panca, and then within it there's division. There was division into individual plots, based on family, but each ruler of Incan society had to found their own panca. So they had to, because the panca lands support the kin group. So you kind of have to conquer land and amass slaves, and then you can found your own imperial panca, and that will support all your kinsmen and be the source of your power. And those people that are in your panca also can become officials and receive the benefits of exploiting other people, of tribute. But then, so there were royal pancas, and then there were also commoner pancas. So, and those didn't have to be founded. Each individual didn't have to found their own territorial clan unit. They just kind of were born into it and had their plots allotted to them. And who lived where and how much they had to contribute was recorded in quipus, which were official documents that the state kept. And of course so it was kind of commoners and then elites was the big bifurcation in Inca society. And elites were sent to different places to rule, to kind of help the empire cohere, because you're bringing in these people who are different, who might have resentments, of course, who've been, forcibly swallowed. So to kind of help keep them and kind of glue them on to the growing state, you send people out there to keep an eye on them. And sometimes if the people were very unstable, very rebellious, they were forcibly moved inland, and kind of separated, and in that way they were totalized by the Inca state. But basically the division, as I see it, was between commoners and elites, and then there were several layers of ruling officials. There were bureaucrats, and there were local leaders, which became part of the new Inca apparatus, the original native leaders that were defeated, unless they were rebellious, they could be removed from power. And then there were regional officials and beyond. And the top was the main leader.
And who were the Ayllus?
The Ayllus were larger units that was just a larger, it was more of a, so the Ayllu was the unit that each specific family was assigned to, whereas the panca was a little in that one.
Yes, and you refer to these peoples as Incas by privilege, or commoner Incas. These people supported the ruling class, providing mercenary services, filling mid-level bureaucratic posts, and acting as retainers, henchmen, and friends to the lords, captains, and servitors of the Inca in exchange, of course, for a share of the reward of imperial expansion. And they were also exempt from tribute.
Yes.
But what I like about this piece is that you mentioned the meter, and Melissa Dell did a study exploring the negative consequences of the meter system, which was basically a system of labor comparable to slavery. Briefly comment on the meter system in the Inca Empire.
Well, so that was the big tax, was labor. So depending on your age and your sex, you were required to contribute different kinds of labor. So for younger men, between age 25 and to a maximum of 50, you had to contribute military service, and you also were assigned to different public works projects, such as building roads or terracing the land, because they practiced terraced agriculture there. Or you could be sent to work the king's personal farmlands that supported him and his panca. And for women, depending on who you were assigned to, you became part of a temple and produced things like beer, like chicha, which is a fermented corn drink for the state, or you produced fabrics. One thing was that when you were very young, your duty was to support your family, so to help your parents with their labor. So at the very least, they allowed parents to take advantage of family labor. But once that period was up, once you were done helping your parents, especially as a man, you had to go work wherever they put you.
The meter and the implications still exist today, as we're informed by Melissa Dell. Another crucial part of the article is the Inca system of colonialism. So colonialism is not unique to Europeans, and you write on the Curacas. Curacas, who did not cooperate with the state, were replaced with puppet leaders. You said, when the Incas conquered a nation, its traditional leaders, Curacas, were left in place, becoming a part of the imperial apparatus. Yes, I would love to hear about colonialism in the Inca Empire.
Well, so once a state was incorporated, the Caraca was left in place, and they were kind of in charge of, the state didn't really interfere so much in some of the day-to-day workings of these conquered communities. So the people could still keep their traditional leader, their Caraca, and they could help resolve conflicts and things like that. And since they knew the people, they were in the best position to kind of keep production going, keep people organized however they had been organized, so that they could produce the goods that the state wanted. And keeping it made sense to keep that local ruler in place, because they're able to communicate, and kind of they have a pre-existing authority with their community, whether it's justified or not, which I think could vary. Of course, in the Americas, there were a lot of voluntary societies, just people following someone that they thought was competent. And then in other cases, it was a much more of a state kind of arrangement, with extractive practices and things like that. But the Caraco was in a good position to get people to possibly remain calm, fulfill their mita, and do what they had been doing so that they could provide what was demanded of them, whatever textiles or corn was being requested by the Cusco central state.
Yes. Daniel, so some time ago, I wrote a piece. It was published by Mises titled, "Let's Stop Ignoring the Colonialism of Non-Westerners." And today we're talking about your piece, Daniela. It's quite unfortunate that beyond Mises, we cannot get serious criticism of non-Western imperialism. So many students study at even the university level assume that only the British built colonies.
Yeah, I think I really like your work, and I see every piece that we publish by you, because I am that person who cleans it up and make sure the commas are in place and things like that. And I think it's great that you bring attention to these different colonial societies, and and you cover Africa and other places that I don't cover. So it's great, because the thing is that this is a relationship that isn't unique to Western people. It's just people being not wanting
Nasty,
to.
that's how people are, they're unkind.
Yeah, they are. And they just, people realize, what? I'm kind of charismatic, and I have some chips that I can play, and and other people aren't so bright, and I can just make these people work for me, get some people behind me that I can split the loot with, and get all these other people to work while I just sit there.
And now we're going to talk about nationalization, because you write that part of the group's lands and herds was nationalized to support the royal corporation, the state clergy, and the state more broadly. And what I have discovered in my own survey of the literature on colonialism is that when Westerners colonize foreign entities, they have the potential to be brutal or even more exploitative, but they also build institutions. In colonial history, it's not really the norm for the more powerful state to build new institutions. The Mongols were not known for institutions. The Vikings built some cities and they assimilated into Christian culture. So in some era, there's a positive relationship between the Vikings and there's a positive relationship between Viking imperialism and development in some areas. But for the most part, the average colonial power is not interested in building institutions.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's really just whatever works. I think the main goal is getting those economic resources. And really, if there's something already in place, even if you want to, if you don't like the culture that's there or the religion, and you have this other goal of, say, Christianizing people, it's best to kind of, what ended up happening with the Incas and with the Mayas, which we'll talk about later, is that the Spanish kind of co-opted their state and just kind of kept that flowing, because the machinery was all there, the infrastructure to collect wealth from people and labor wealth. So they could just keep taking that, and then later, when they were in a better position, they could kind of dismantle that and replace it with their own system. But really, I think that the main thing is just to take from people, however you can.
Yes,
So.
but before we move on to talk about the Mayans, I must read this excerpt. There was little way to escape the part-time slavery of the Inca Empire. There was no free travel. Government thugs were posted at every town and at bridges to make sure people did not leave without permission. People were forced to wear the unique garb of their natal communities, so that those who might be traveling illegally could be identified and checked. This is more than a nanny state. And you also say that in the Inca society, one had to complete the work of his neighbor if his neighbor failed to do so.
Yes. Yeah, so it was a lot more of a socialist empire, as some scholars have pointed out, because they kind of the state kind of stipulated exactly what had to be given, and it doesn't seem that there was any flexibility with that. So if someone was sick or something, or they found a way to escape or something, or they were killed, it didn't matter. Someone had to do their work and pay it. And there was, things had to be done. There wasn't really any room for, it wasn't really entrepreneurial. Food had to be made the same way, prepared the same way. It could never be cooked a different way or anything like that. It was the same goods, prepared the same way, collected by the bureaucrats and shipped off to, the regional centers and Cuzco. And then it was held in warehouses, where it was distributed, around the empire as needed. So it doesn't seem that it was really a market society. It seems like a very centrally planned society.
The Inca Empire did not envision personalities, in the words of Louis Baudin. I read his book, The Socialism of the Inca.
Yeah, he's the main person I have in mind, because really, I didn't, when I was looking for books to study, good quality books published by reputable presses, really he was the only one who came out and said, this was a socialist empire. Even though others, like the other book I used just to kind of balance my essay is by a socialist scholar, and he says it's a pre-capitalist empire. Yeah, but they say the same things, and that's why if you look at my footnotes, I cite them side by side. They identify the same control, the same central planning, but they just kind of interpret it in different ways.
Yes, but we're going to move on to talk about the Mayans. But before we do so, if you're unfamiliar with him, I must introduce Alan Colata. He has produced some rather interesting pieces on the exploitative nature of the Inca civilization.
Oh, cool.
Yes, but now we're going to talk about the Mayans, and I will begin with this citation from Hispanicist Lynn V. Foster, sorry. The 100 years beginning around 672 witnessed the flowering of many great cities. Competition among these Maya cities fueled more wars and demand for tribute. Wealth generated building booms and increased production of luxury goods. The result was a period fraught with political tension and warfare, but also one in which artistic production culminated in the greatest works of Maya civilization. Now you can just go ahead and tell us about decentralization in the Mayan Empire and its benefits.
Yeah. So with the, and I think this is more the case than with the Inca Empire, but the Mayas were scattered over what is now, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and they were a lot more similar ethnically than all the different people that the Incas absorbed. They all spoke different varieties of the Mayan language, but they were more closely connected. Whereas with the Inca Empire, they eventually were forced to learn Quechua. So and that was another way of controlling subjugated people. But they were, whether it's because of, I think part of it has to do with geography, perhaps. the Mayas were never one empire. They were divided into a bunch of different little princedoms and states scattered all through that area. But they did have the seed of what makes, where any state begins, and the most monstrous state. It's the idea that that somebody knows best, and that because they know best, they have the right to that you have to support them so that they can run your life. And from there, just all kinds of corruption grows, and they want to expand and continue to collect. And so there was war between some of these different states trying to absorb other ones and become bigger and bigger players in the region.
Yes, and you're basically saying that the collapse of the Mayan civilization engendered decentralization and the flowering of progress and trade. Many tend to lament the collapse of the Mayan civilization.
Yes. They say, that the classic era, which was the time where there were the most big cities, the most major states, that this was the best period, that there were, the greatest achievements were accomplished, big infrastructure projects, the big pyramids, the huge stone sculptures of rulers with, records of what they did, their policies. Just, it seemed like it was a great time for them. But really, to me, what happened after shows that maybe it wasn't so great. And the thing is, the collapse is a very disputed thing. There's a lot that contributed to it. Scholars say that there was an agricultural failure. They talk about war between the different states. They talk about climate change. There are a lot of possible reasons that may have catalyzed this massive abandonment of all these different places and the creation of new states. Because this classic area where there were a lot of big states, what was concentrated in the southern lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, and then in the post-classic era, all the big powers were more concentrated in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. So that can kind of point to something to do with the land. But other societies have experienced agricultural failure and not collapse. So it seems that there's something more to it, and that the state has something to do with it. Somehow, for some reason, all these rulers lost credibility, because it's not, people didn't pick up and follow the same ruler north and just set up shop there. And, they couldn't have, because there were other people living over there, and that wouldn't have been okay. So something happened such that in the post-classic era, after the big collapse, there were all these smaller states. There wasn't as much public works. There wasn't the same idolization of these divine lords. People focused less on the body of the king, and more on, there was more shared power. The council was more important of each place, the local court, not just the divine lord himself, and there was more trade, less effort devoted to these huge projects that may seem grand, but whether they were really what people wanted is never really known, because it's the whole concept of the seen and the unseen. Like what we see is a giant road or something, the interstate highway system in the US, but did people really need that? Did they really want it? What could have been if we just left the old US highway system and not built the interstate highway system, for example?
And
So
that's
that's, yes.
I love the part in your essay where you say the people, they just abandoned the state. They moved on. When the state collapsed, they moved on, and it ushered a period of liberation.
Yeah, it's just amazing because it wasn't so difficult to pick up, you know, because the houses could be built pretty easily. And I don't know, they don't seem to have really landscaped the same way to, you know, it seems that they didn't have to prepare the land in the same way to plant crops as say the Incas. So it seems that it was easier for them to just pick up and move somewhere better, and that really helped.
And before we move on, because we also have another paper, Pre-Columbian America wasn't exactly a paradise of freedom. In the Mayan society and the Inca society and many other societies, laborers who built monumental projects did not necessarily have a say in doing so. So in Egypt, according to new archaeological data, the pyramids were not built by slaves, but by farmers. However, the Taj Mahal was financed by imposing a tax on poor villagers. And many of those who worked and labored tirelessly to complete the Taj Mahal didn't really want to do it. And there are examples of many buildings that were created by slaves, but presently today in Western societies, there is a racial reckoning because of the statue of people like Cecil Rhodes. I don't hear people in white Western societies lamenting that the Taj Mahal was financed by a tax on poor workers.
Yeah, it's just crazy the way that things are kind of seen differently because the people who did them weren't white. I mean, even you know, I've read about Incan sacrifice,
And
where,
Mayan too, the
and
Mayans.
yes, also they also did it too. But you know, when people talk about these kids being taken, and you know what, you know, they were kind of in the case of the Incas, kids were sacrificed and they were intoxicated for days, like, you know, fed a bunch of chicha and given these other meals, and they were kind of, sometimes they were kind of in a stupor, and then other time it seems that they struggled because, you know, mummies have been found, you know, that these poor kids were kind of entombed alive at, you know, after being taken from their families and drugged. And that is just, it's not kind of judged as barbaric, you know. It's just, you know, it's part of their culture, and you know, they believed that they were doing, you know, that they were special because they had been chosen. Well, I don't know, the one kid who was found in a cave somewhere in what is now Peru, it seems like he struggled. Like there are signs that he was trying to get free. Like, so I don't think he was wild about the idea. And you know, the same goes for, you know, less gruesome stuff. You know, slavery is slavery. You know, scholars of African slavery and you know, and indigenous slavery in the Americas talk about how it was different. You know, they, you know, it wasn't as bad. Like it even
Not
happens when,
true. Not true, Daniela. I interviewed an expert on the topic, Aviva Ben Not true.
well, yeah, I mean, slavery is slavery. You're not free to, you know, to use your labor and go where you wish, and you know, so it doesn't matter. That comparison's even made between northern and southern slavery, but that's another story. But even there in New York, like, slaves have been found, the bodies of slaves, and their bones are all bent up. You know, you can see the labor they did, how hard they worked, you know. But it's just putting people, you know, measuring them by a different yardstick. Because
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
simple as that.
it is shameful. I think that it is shameful, and I don't find it endearing, and I'm Black. And my race should have some merit because we live in a world that's obsessed with race. And as a Black person, I'm just annoyed. It's infuriating.
Yeah, well, it's just, it's in a way, it's kind of, I see it as kind of condescending that people don't think that other people are capable of doing ill,
Yes,
of
if you
coming up.
exactly, if you are unable to do evil, you're basically a child.
Yeah,
You have no agency. Free agents will exercise evil, and they will also do good.
yeah. Well, I did take a brief foray when I was in grad school into very early Spanish Florida, and what I found is that the leaders of some of the people there, like the Calusas and the Appalachies, they benefited from the missionary system because they weren't the ones who had to work because they were caciques, leaders, which this term actually comes from the Caribbean native peoples, but the Spanish Empire kind of applied it to all Indian peoples. So they probably called their leaders something else in what is now Florida, but just to be able to use a simple term, caciques.
Yeah, the
So
cacique, yes.
those people, yeah. So they were able to get more gifts, more Spanish goods, these new goods that even though they might, and this is the concept of subjective value, even though to Europeans maybe an awl wasn't a big deal, a metal awl, well, it was valuable to people who had never seen something like that in North America, a much more powerful tool, and it's hard to find over there. I mean, it's only when these strangers come by on these ships that you can get something like that. Of course they value it, and that's totally valid. But in short, like these leaders of different indigenous communities, in some cases benefited from contact with Europeans, and I think kind of sold things that they weren't authorized to sell, sold out their people. And does that sound very shocking?
No, many of them did, especially in Africa. Dahomey, the Linas, many states became powerful because of the slave trade. And in pre-Columbian societies, income inequality was tolerated. Based on the data, the level of income inequality in the ancient world was intermediate, and there's a new study on income inequality in pre-colonial Mexico. It was an intermediate level of income inequality, and furthermore, people tolerated it. So some individuals, by virtue of their class, could have multiple wives. They lived in better houses. Income inequality was tolerated in those societies.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I am not impressed by the hysteria of Western critics, not at all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me neither, to
Yes.
say the least.
Yeah. But before we wrap up, pre-Columbian America wasn't exactly a paradise of virtue. In this piece, you discuss pre-colonial Indians and groups and their tributary systems, and as you say, tribute payments were involuntary. There is even a record of people hiding food in underground storage pits in addition to the above ground buildings, specifically designated as storehouses, possibly to keep more of their wealth. As contemporaneous observer William Strachey noted, their corn and indeed their copper, hatchets, beads, pearl, and most things with them of value, according to their own estimation, they hide one from the knowledge of another in the ground within the woods, and so keep them all the year or until they are fit use for them. And when they take them forth, they scarce make their women privy to the storehouse.
Yeah. So I think so here's one thing that's important. Some scholars who want to push this narrative of colonialism and racial subjugation and native defeat, at the hands of white peoples. They will say that, like William Strachey, like he can't be trusted, because he's a white guy, but he didn't know the people well enough, wasn't a member of the culture, so they kind of downplay the testimony that was provided by some of these early observers. But I think that people are people, and that people are capable of learning a language, of making signs to each other, of communicating, and I fundamentally believe in that, and some scholars just seem not to. They think that it's impossible for an outsider to ever understand anything. But also, you can, think you can perceive things. That's something that, maybe, a lot of those of the postmodern bent would disagree with, but it's what we have to work with. You can see people hiding stuff. There's another storehouse where all the stuff is hidden. So then what is this other storehouse?
It's a figurine.
Yeah, I mean, it's something else, It could be that maybe there was a secret storehouse in case of an attack by a rival group, but it doesn't seem like it, because what he's saying, he's talking about these small individual like hiding holes in the ground somewhere. He's not talking about something they all agreed to, like okay, we'll have most of the stuff in the village, but then just in case someone comes to burn down our village and steal our food, we'll have a hidden place where we store some backup food together. But it doesn't sound like that's what that was.
Not at all. But people can utter some dubious remarks when they're surveying the history of non-Westerners. So Daniela, I really enjoy our conversation, but unfortunately I have to go. These days I'm planning to do shorter shows. So we have been speaking for over 40 minutes, but it has been a pleasure. Bye, Daniela.
Bye. It was my pleasure.
All right.
Have a great day.
You too.